On our panel today, we have four guests. I'm going to start with Victoria because most of you, if you've watched any office hours in the past, you already know Victoria. She's a strength and conditioning consultant here at Volt and previously head of performance and PE coordinator at Ransom Everglades School in Florida, Miami, Florida, right?
That's right.
Next up, I'll introduce Lindsey Hamiliton. She's head of mental conditioning at IMG Academy, also in Florida. And the stats that I have for her is, at least at IMG, you're working with and teaching mental skills to about 1,400 kids across 8 sports throughout the year. Is that track?
That is correct. My staff and I, so I have 50 mental performance coaches that service that number of athletes. But yes, that's correct.
And that's the full age range, right? What is that age range?
Primarily, I'd say 10 all the way up through 19 after post-grad year after high school, but the bread and butter really is those high school years in particular.
Next, I'm going to introduce Greg Bishop. So Greg was Victoria's boss in a previous job, and Victoria's pumped to have him on too. Former head of sport performance at Harvard Westlake School in Southern California. You were working with grades 7 through 12, and you actually had 2 different campuses, so 2 different facilities to serve that population. Is that right?
Yeah, we did. We kind of, it was nice. We started with a high school program, but our high school was a little different. We only had it was grades 10 through 12 in the separate campus. We eventually put in a weight room there, and it allowed us to really integrate and spend time with the lower kids without worrying about lifting heavy things. We just got to teach them how to do things correctly. So.
Oh, I'm assuming that's where Victoria's got her passion for long-term athletic development.
I think she had before she got there. I think we really clicked together in terms of the philosophy of just being able to take our time and not have to worry about numbers. It was just about teaching.
Yeah. Develop.
And Jen Foster. So the most important thing about Jen is that she's almost at year 3 as a Volt customer. And I'm a little bit biased, but she's head field hockey coach at Salve, Regina University. 8 seasons as head coach, and then you were also an assistant there previously. Is that right? Before you became head coach?
No, actually, it's going to be my 8th season, and I was also the head coach of lacrosse for 8 seasons.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So double duty for 8 years. Yep.
Yeah. That's awesome. So the first question that I have for the whole panel, I'm going to have some general questions for everybody and then maybe some more targeted ones. But the first one is going to be a very, very broad and open question to kick us off. Do coaches need to treat female athletes and male athletes, or female teams and male teams, differently? Should they, or do they even need to? And why or why not?
Sure. Well, I've never coached a male team, so that perspective I don't really have. But our female athletes want to be treated as equals. They want to be training the same way. They want to be pushed the same way. So I don't think you should necessarily train them differently. They may have some different goals and mindsets to how they want to approach it. But from my perspective, you train an athlete like an athlete. It really shouldn't be too different in terms of male and female.
I also correct that you have young boys of your own?
I have 2 daughters and 1 boy. So yes,
okay.
I kind of see it from the 2 perspectives. Yes. But my husband's the men's basketball coach here at Salve. So obviously see how his team uses Volt and how our team uses Volt. So get the different perspectives.
Lindsey, you're next on my screen. Want to go ahead and take a stab at the question?
Yeah, I would agree with Jen that, they really shouldn't be treated differently. I would say the nuance that I would add is, we don't want to treat them differently, but as coaches, do we need to broaden our awareness about things that can impact female athletes that maybe the male athletes we don't have to consider? To that, I would say yes. So while that doesn't necessarily impact how we treat them or how we train them, or what mindset or attitude we come with that might come with that. But I think, having an awareness about things that can impact their experience in sport and their decision to be there and where they want to go with it, we can broaden our awareness that could impact our interactions for sure.
Greg, from a coaching standpoint, development standpoint, we'll get into the more of the strength and conditioning side a little bit later, the technical stuff. But yeah, from your experience, how would you go about addressing that question?
Oh boy. I disagree. I I had a different relationship with my female athletes than I did with the males. And some of those were age related. We started with kids when they were 10, or I guess 12. So at that point, we had a lot of these girls that were premenstrual. And so we were able to really start out treating them the same, but over time, it really did start to shift. And the way I felt that when I was working with female athletes, they were looking more to me, they didn't care how much I lifted personally, right? Boys would ask, hey, how much do you lift? And that would kind of give you credibility with them. And when it comes to the female athletes, they wanted to know that they could go and trust you. And it was more relationship driven than it was with the boys for me. I could have boys in there and you had to have a relationship with them, but it was go do your work and get there. And they're like, yeah, but do you care when you're working with a female athlete? There were numerous times where I'd have female athletes in my office complaining about their sport coach. And I didn't ever have that conversation with a male athlete, but they needed a vent and that. So it was a little bit more of I wouldn't say a friend role, but a confidant. They really did depend much more on the social and kind of trust side of it.
Great. Yeah. And actually, I think this is a good time to maybe return back to Lindsey. One of the things you mentioned is some of the different sport experiences that you might want to consider when it comes to working with female versus male athletes. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I would actually totally agree with Greg here. To the extent that, I'm not treating the athletes differently. I'm not saying I can't push them as hard, right? I'm not saying like, oh, I should interact, like I should hold them back, or, a lot of people will think like girls don't want to be as competitive, or girls don't want to, this, that, and the other. And so we treat them differently. But what Greg is saying about the relationship is super important and highly relevant. And so for us to be aware and broaden our understanding that young girls or women in general, they are very relational. In fact, that's very much how they find motivation to engage in a sport in particular, right? Is it's about friendships and so forth. So I'll paint this picture, and it sort of sounds like it's pretty similar to Greg, but my experience in working with male and female athletes is if you watch teams come together, the males will pick out who's the best performer and form a relationship that they can then play with. So I want to go with the person that's really good. I want to play with the fastest player. I want to play with the people who can like really compete at this level. And like I understand their performance. And so then we form this relationship, and now we can play together, right? If you look at a female team and how they kind of come together and they form, they're looking, who can I be friends with first? And I'm going to build my relationship, and then I'm going to play with you, right? And then I'll perform with you. So you can see this even based on like how guys and girls warm up. A lot of the guys will end up finding someone who is at a similar skill level. And a lot of the young ladies will find who their friend is, regardless of skill level. So I think to what Greg is saying, being aware that women and young girls are highly relationship driven, and that can inform how we interact with them, or maybe understanding that they need to have these conversations for us to be able to get the most out of them. But it's really, they're all vehicles to help us continue to train them at the high level so they can be competitive, or even just keep them in the sport, right? Like not everybody's high performance, but the most important thing is the kids come back to play against the next year, right? We don't want anyone to lose out of playing on the next season because they haven't been treated the way that they might want to be in the experience. So I would totally agree with Greg on that relationship side for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about when it comes to team building with your team and building trust and building culture? We don't really necessarily, I don't know if we need to do any comparing and contrasting, but I'd love to just kind of hear how you have gone about, or how you continue to go about building that team culture, building that trust and relationship amongst your team.
Well, every year you're inviting a new freshman class. And I think that really is, we're starting during the recruiting process, having them get to know the team. We do a sister, summer groups leading into preseason, because that relationship piece is huge. And the girls really, they need to have that trust and that friendship before I think they can get to that competitive piece. We actually brought in a mindset coach this year to work with our team this spring to really talk about, controllables, uncontrollables, self-talk, because I think sometimes our players are sometimes their worst critics. They're tougher on themselves sometimes than I need to be. So really having that piece has been important to build the team culture. I work with our leadership. We have a leadership committee in season, which consists of our captains and then a junior, sophomore, and freshman representative, really to get all voices heard. I don't believe it's just seniors or the leaders on the team. It really comes from all levels. And girls are starting to buy into that. They're starting to realize, even as a freshman, you have a lot to give to the program. You have experience from high school. And we want to hear it. So that's been something that we've been really driving home with the team, the spring, using the mindset coach to kind of talk about a whole as a person, how you can become a better athlete and be a better person, to then help the team. So every year is a little bit different. Each team dynamic is different. I really try to rely on our leaders to say, okay, what does this team need? What do we need to get better at? What are our strengths? What are our areas to improve, and build from there? But we've had some young teams the last couple of years, so it's been very important that we grew that leadership from below, or we were going to struggle with just a few seniors, possibly some years.
What does female specific training look like? Is it necessary? Would love to kind of hear your approach, Greg, to kick us off.
I think female specificity really, you kind of approach it the same way as almost like a sports specificity. I think I always approached it from, you have the same building blocks, you have the same starting off point, but it would diverge based on the team and the strength and the weaknesses, the injury likelihood. My girls soccer team had different training concerns than girls water polo, or girls cross country. I think one of the biggest things is probably, well, there's a couple. I would say, because we saw the girls over a longer span, like we were fortunate to have a 6-year kind of training block with them. I think they start out similar and then they diverge across time, right? Because when you're starting with some of these boys and girls who are prepubertal, your strength curves are almost inverted, right? We had girls that were lifting as much or more than a lot of boys in the middle school. And over time, puberty happens, their bodies start to change, and you start to have more training considerations for the girls. And so that was one big thing. I think you did have to actually take into account, I always did, at least the kind of the emotional side and the physiological side of the actual menstrual cycle too. I mean, when you're dealing with adolescent girls, there were days when girls would come in and they're like, I just don't feel good today, right? Or there was a girl who, she had real problems and with her menstrual cycle, and eating became difficult. Like, she just felt terrible when she had her period. And so I had to take that into account. So those are the major things that really determined it from like the female side. But in terms of like exercises, I mean, they all squat, they all push, they all pull, which was, those are the main components, of the strength side. But that didn't really change much, unless that was a sport consideration. But it wasn't really a sex consideration in that sense. So, and I just want to clarify, like, for me, sex was purely based on biological sex, not gender. I didn't, I don't know if I've been detached for that long. Gender was not as big of a thing. It came up sometimes, but, for me, just from my background, sex and gender were two different things. And when I say sex, I'm talking purely biological. So I just want to be clear on that.
So I think, Greg, you were probably the one that showed me this, but from a physiological standpoint, I think the most common physiological difference, or I should say prevalent injury in females, is most of us know at this point that they're more susceptible to ACLs. And so you may see in some training programs additional work to prevent that, or I should say mitigate that, because not all things are preventable. But for coaches on the call, there are a couple they call prevention programs. I like to call them mitigation programs, but warm-ups that are out there. There's the Santa Monica PEP program, which I'm pretty sure, Greg, you're the one that showed me that. And then the FIFA 11 Plus So if you take something away from this conversation, I would definitely recommend looking up the FIFA 11 Plus and the Santa Monica PEP programs. And the Santa Monica PEP program really is focused on mitigating the ACL injury for women. So definitely something to Google search on your way out of here. The other, I think, important topic that Greg brings up is normalizing the conversation around girls having their periods. And I know it is a very uncomfortable conversation for many people. It's really uncomfortable for women to have these conversations. And, statistically speaking, there are more male coaches out there than female coaches. So a lot of the times your female athletes are going to be having conversations with their male coaches, and male coaches are going to be having these conversations with their female athletes. And it's easy to ignore the conversation, right? Because it's not something that we can visibly see. It's not something that we always know is happening. Every female gets it at a different time. So it's really hard to, and every female gets it and has a different experience, right? You have a total spectrum of symptoms and experiences. And even those symptoms and experiences fluctuate from their first time to their last time. So, I really am going to put a lot of pressure on coaches moving forward to normalize those conversations and have them, don't steer away from them. They are uncomfortable, but the more we talk about them, the less uncomfortable they're going to be. Have that open door policy, or maybe address it right away. Just, we all know what's happening. Everybody knows what's going on. And just make your female athletes comfortable in the sense that they can talk to you about it. And be able to express their symptoms and how they feel. And as more mature that they get in their athletic careers, they'll be able to hopefully articulate that a little bit better. But I would say I wouldn't just brush it off. It's easy to just say, oh, she's having cramps, or oh, her stomach hurts, or those are real symptoms. And they definitely can affect performance from a mental standpoint, maybe not from a purely physiological performance standpoint. Like, can their muscles still contract and activate in a timely manner? Yes. But they're feeling ill, or they're feeling a certain way. So it can certainly affect their performance. And there are a ton of, there's a ton of research out there that does suggest that the fluctuation in hormones can affect them differently at certain times and during their menstrual cycle. The reality is their bodies are preparing to have a child. And that's a big deal. So there's even research that suggests they could be a little bit more prone to injury when they're on their periods. But with that said, you have a team of 20 girls. You can't really change your training plans because they're all going to be on their periods at different times. I think there's just an awareness piece to at least know that these things are occurring. And like Greg said, it could be affecting more than just, in that moment. It could be affecting their caloric intake, could be affecting their sleep. So these are things that, once again, just an awareness piece to have. And if you don't feel qualified to handle some of these conversations or potential limiting factors, outsource, find somebody that can help them, find ways to help them relieve some of their symptoms, because that's really the number one problem when they have their periods. But get comfortable. I was a PE teacher. Greg was a PE teacher. First day of class, I just say periods, just say it, get people comfortable saying it, because it is uncomfortable. And then everybody laughs and everybody giggles. And, maybe that's not the case with your college athletes, but at least from, a younger athlete standpoint, just talk about it in front of boys, talk about it in front of girls, talk about it in front of your whole staff, and just make your female athletes comfortable enough so that they can share it. And then that you can help them at the end of the day.
Victoria actually just wrote a blog article. So if you type in blog.voltathletics.com, the first article that shows up today, March 27th, the first article that shows up will be on this topic, written by Victoria. So encourage everybody to check that out. Common myths or misconceptions or mistruths about coaching female athletes that might be detrimental and that we should try and address. Do any come to mind?
Yeah, where do you start? It's only 60 minutes, Yes, I think that there's a handful. I'll only highlight maybe a couple of them here. I think one of them I've kind of already alluded to is that common myth is that like girls don't want to be as aggressive or as assertive or as competitive. Like that's just not true. You know, how we go about creating an optimal environment of competition, we might approach that differently, but like girls want to be pushed, women want to be challenged. They want to get to the best version of themselves too. So I think that's a common myth. I think, you know, to this conversation about what Greg and Vic have sort of highlighted here is that like the period does matter and it is a real thing. And so, you know, not pretending that that's not the case, but being willing to normalize that. I would say from my perspective on like the mental side, but what I see a lot of synergy across nutrition and strength and conditioning is misconceptions about like body image and body composition and standards for body composition, that like certain lean muscle mass composition and fat mass, and that, you know, you should get to this standard. And like a lot of coaches, unfortunately, are just really misinformed about what's appropriate for a young female athlete's development and what that looks like and so forth. That, you know, that the male version is the standard and women should strive to be at that. That's not the case. The science would suggest that's not effective even. So I think some of those conceptions that like women need to be like the version of the male standard from a body composition perspective, specifically in sport, is something that we probably need to have more conversation about.
Jen, would you like to maybe hop in and give some of your perspective on this?
I think the first point that Lindsey made about, you know, girls not wanting to be competitive or aggressive, I think that's a major myth, or maybe that they don't even want to like strength train, that's not as important to them. I think over the years, I've seen our players want it more and more structure, hence why we went to Volt, to have that, you know, structure built in and explanations and just a great overall body workout. Because I saw my players, they wanted more. And, you know, we have 20 sports here at Salve. It just wasn't going to happen that we were going to get enough particular attention to our sport. So Volt allowed us to do that. But I think just in general that, you know, female athletes want to train, they want to push themselves to that new level, is a big myth that comes to my mind, especially just seeing how our team has developed over the years.
Greg or Victoria, anything else that either of you would add?
I would say, I think and again, this is like ancient history when I started, but, you know, early 2000s when we started our program, I mean, we were kind of one of the first to have this fully integrated, you know, full-time staff in high school. And it allowed us to really change the culture of athletics and the way they approached, you know, not only the boys' sports, but the girls' sports. But I think one of the most persistent ones is when girls would kind of join teams and first get introduced to the weight room. There were a lot of discussions or comments from the girls, you know, about getting buff. But you know what, over time, I think that kind of went away and they started to embrace it, because eventually, you know, our girls soccer team embraced that buffness, and they would brag about how they were able to physically move the other girls. And so, but I would say that was one thing that really kind of persisted amongst the adolescents, was just like, oh, am I going to get buff because I'm lifting weights? And I would always tell them, look, you're not training nearly hard enough to get that buff, so don't worry about it. Nor do you have enough testosterone in your body really to look like, you know, this. I think at one point I had a PowerPoint presentation where I think I put up a picture of some female bodybuilder, and I was like, look, you don't take enough drugs or work hard enough to look like this. So let's just put it all on the table. Just come and work hard. Are you going to get stronger? Yeah. Are you going to get muscles? Maybe, but trust me, it's not going to be this cartoonish thing in your mind. So that was one of the things that we had to combat in the high school.
It's one of those myths that still exists, kind of like the myth that weight training stunts your growth. We still haven't like weeded those out yet. Actually, I don't remember if it was my conversation with your team, Jen, but it is a question I often get from the female athletes is, I don't want to get buff. And my response is very similar to Greg's, like, okay, well, lay off the steroids then, you know, because that's the only way you're really going to get buff. But it goes back to our point of these training considerations for our female athletes is some of, at least in my experience, they do want to know the whys, they do want to know the hows, they do want a little bit more of an explanation than the guys do. So explaining to them why they're not going to get buff will also, you know, soothe a bit of their anxiety that they don't want to train as hard or pick up heavier weights because of the appearance that they may end up projecting. But for those of you coaches that are out there, it's a very simple explanation. They're not going to get buff, right? It is a combination of probably 2-a-days and steroids that are going to make them look that way. So hopefully we can slowly start crushing that myth little by little here. The other, I think, myth or maybe stigma is that female athletes want to be treated fairly. And I think the word should be, they just want some equity, and they want to have the same resources. I do talk to a lot of coaches, and I do a lot of not just female coaches, but coaches who are representing a female team. Often find themselves in a situation where their females aren't feeling, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, Bo, but their female athletes aren't feeling like they're cared for or getting the same resources or getting the same attention as their male counterparts. And so they deserve to be treated and given the same resources. And I'm just curious if Jen or Lindsey, if you want to chime in here, if this is something that, is a training consideration for your female athletes. Do they express this, this sort of feeling? How do you combat it? Because that is not just a stigma. That's a reality for many of our female athletes in their athletic experiences. So just curious, I know I sort of felt it when I was a female athlete. So just curious kind of what your experiences are and how you combat your female athletes who feel that way.
We were feeling that here. I think it goes back to we were 20 sports and there was only a couple of strength coaches on staff, and they just couldn't tailor enough to each team or give enough attention. Hence why we went to Volt. I think the girls just felt like they were doing the same workouts as football was doing, and they weren't understanding the why behind it. And that's why I know when we had the Zoom with Victoria, it was really helpful for her to explain why the workouts were the way they were and why we were doing things that way, and to get that buy-in to understand. But yeah, I did think they felt it. I don't think it was just our female athletes. I think it was just a resource here that we needed more. And that's why we decided to go with Volt to help us have that extra resource. That was the only thing I could do. I knew this wasn't my expertise, and I really wanted to get the help for them so they could feel confident in their training. It really has made a difference in the last couple of years since we started that.
I would add, that's definitely an experience that we see in women's sports across the gamut, whether that's at the high school level or the collegiate level and the professional level and so forth. It is a very real experience, and people notice, right? Girls feel that. And when we go back to thinking about like where females and girls are orienting their experience of sport from, it's about like collaboration and connecting, right? And if they feel disconnected from the organization because of perceptions of unfairness, then they feel some type of way about that. And I think that that's appropriate. And, we can get into some really in-depth conversation around this with regard to, like, especially when you get to the higher levels, like pay and, monetizing the sport and all those different kinds of things. But there are still some very real misconceptions that persist that like women athletics don't actually get that visibility, when there's a lot of statistics to show like they have more fan support and more interest. And, so the times haven't caught up with the techniques haven't caught up with really the times of that support. But, young women do feel like that. And they can, when they do, it creates this negative experience for them. And then nobody wants to perform in that space. So I think that's something that we are up against, obviously within the system that we're in the sporting industry, but when we're having these conversations, right? Like the fact that Greg can share how his like female informed training is, like what he's doing with that, or, that Jen can go out and she can seek her resources, because if she's not getting it there, then we have an advocate, like a head coach here, that's going to go and find a way to make sure that her kids get what they need. I sat in on an in-service training this morning about talking about periods with, coaches who work with female teams. Like these things are a necessary part of like, we are invested in the female athletic experience, and, that will translate into the resources that we are providing for our student athletes and the care and the support that they are getting. But the ship definitely turns slowly, but we're hoping turning it.
There's two examples that I've seen working at Volt and in other areas where really seeing that even one coach or one team at a school can really rise the tide of everybody else at the school. These happen to be examples within Volt. They don't have to be, but they just are. And I think there's probably similar situations at other organizations. But I've seen, number one, where, giving an example of a small college where, potentially the only person who has any expertise from a strength conditioning standpoint is maybe an assistant coach for football. Let's just call it what it is. It's usually where that experience lies, right? And so they, of course, spend all their time, and then maybe one or two other sports, or maybe only in-season sports, whatever it might be. And so coach goes out and says, hey, let's get Volt for our team so that we can get some quality training for our team, give us more guidance, more structure, and then prove that this is a valuable area for our athletic department to invest funds. So they start with their one team, the field hockey team, the soccer team, the volleyball team, whatever it is. One of them starts it out, proves out the value, shows results. You get that team in the weight room, using the weight room consistently, and it starts to create buzz and word spreads. And now you have a couple other teams that hop on. And after 1 or 2 years, now the athletic department is seriously considering hiring a full-time strength conditioning coach, hiring a couple assistants to really rise the tide of the entire athletic department. Have seen that several times in my time at Volt. We're just happy we get to be a bit of a conduit for that. Another example is at a really small high school. I want to either say it was in the Northeast, or it might have even been in like Nome, Alaska, but a really, really small school. It's probably Northeast because it was actually a field hockey team, high school field hockey. The coach wanted to get some resources for her girls because they were afraid of going in the weight room. They were intimidated by all the boys in the weight room, and they didn't have a strength conditioning coach. So they got Volt, and they were training on it. And 3 months later, her field hockey girls are teaching the baseball players how to lift weights, right? And it's super impressive, super exciting. Athletic director sees it and is like, oh, that is awesome. Like, we need to get more of our teams doing this. And so it grows from there. So I guess I want to share a couple anecdotes. I think my overall takeaway message is I think it can start with one team, right? It can start with one coach. It might not happen quickly, but that can be the spark that elevates the culture at the entire organization. One of the common areas of pushback was, okay, how do I help my team get over this stigma of, training is going to make me bulky, it's going to make me buff or whatever. I found that in a lot of situations, rather than kind of running from the problem or trying to avoid the stigma, is actually kind of just chasing the benefits and trying to explain that the program is created for these performance factors or for this sport or whatever it might be. What kind of measurements would you maybe track? And was that something that was effective for helping to kind of get the right mindset towards training?
Oh, we always liked the testing to happen a little more organically, because I didn't really want to take a whole day away from training just to, do maxes and things like that. Obviously, if you're in a football setting, that's kind of the culture, so you can get away with it a little bit more. It's kind of like it's an event. With more Olympic sports and girls and women's sports, I think we used some of the sports specific variables, right? With soccer, it was a beep test. With track and field, it kind of has a built-in measurement every time you go to practice, so that when you didn't really have to test a track and field athlete in that sense. But it was about letting them know how it could benefit them, getting together with the coach, figuring out how to objectively decide if the program is working, if there were subjectively things we were leaving out that they thought might help to get the girls to buy in. Again, trying to build that trust and relationship. And so, half the relationship was not only with the girl, the female athletes, but it was the coach too. So I think testing is important because you have to have some type of objective measure, but it's so variable. You could use the traditional ones, of jumping and running, things like that, because they're fairly universal, unless we're talking, right, like a golf or swimming. But I think testing is a good idea.
I think it goes back to our point earlier of, girls are just as competitive as their male counterparts, and not even just the competition aspect of testing, but who doesn't want to see progress? And I think if we can objectively measure progress, that's where the buy-in also comes too. So I wouldn't shy away from testing. If you have female athletes, you know, there's a billion tests out there with normative data. You don't have to just do the standard bench, squat, clean tests. There's a ton. They can be push-ups, they can be chin-ups, they can be a chin-up hold. It can be any other sort of variation of one of those tests. You can make it your own. I know I have a lot of conversations with coaches about putting together testing for their programs. But I think it's important to know that, you know, female athletes do want to know if they're getting better. It is hard to objectively measure that during a game, especially if you're in a position like defense. You know, you can't track how many goals you've made, things like that. It is hard to sort of know where you are, but especially in a weight room setting, we have plenty of ways to objectively measure progress. So I would definitely encourage our coaches to do some sort of testing, not just from a competition piece or a camaraderie piece, but just for tracking progress.
Let's set up a scenario where there's a coach who's coming in and taking over a program for the first time. Let's say it's a sport coach in this example, getting to know the team, getting to know the other staff at the school. What do you think are some of the key first steps for somebody who is taking over a program, be it a field hockey team or volleyball or whatever it might be?
First thing, finding out who the leadership is on the team. I think that was something that I knew when I was first hired here. I literally was hired 2 weeks before the field hockey season actually started. So just finding out who are the captains, who are maybe the ones that are the big ones for the weight room. Like that would be the leadership that would really drive that, and just finding out kind of how things have been going and where do they want to get to. You know, every team's, it's going to be different. You know, every school's different in terms of resources, but obviously any school, you need to get on the same page of the athletic director, find out what the expectations are and what are the resources that you have, and try to see where there are discrepancies, how you work that. But I think in terms of the team is finding out who the leadership is, who are the ones that are really the driving force behind it, and sitting down with them and finding out what their goals are and how can you start approaching. You're not going to get everything in a minute. You know, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a few years, especially, you know, at the college level, it takes a few recruiting classes to even get it to be truly your team. So I think that's something you got to take in consideration. I knew I learned that pretty young as a new coach. I thought it was all going to be X's and O's, and it really wasn't. There was a lot of other things that needed to go into, you know, the team building, the team culture. So you need to get the leadership of the team on board with you first, I think is a very important part.
I'm assuming most of the people watching this are either going to be sport coaches or strength coaches. We probably won't have a ton of mental skills coaches or consultants on the call. So in speaking to the audience of the strength coach or the sport coach, from a mental skills standpoint, how do they go about finding the right resources? You know, how can you maybe implement that with your team, and where do you start?
Finding the right resources just in general or specifically?
Yeah, for developing mental skills. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So you know, there's a lot of stuff online, and then I hesitate to say that because anybody can put anything online. So if you're looking for a mental skills coach, a mental performance coach, I would definitely, if you were looking for resources, I would find someone who is CMPC designated. So they're a certified mental performance coach through the Association for Applied Sports Psychology. This is a designation that indicates a bare minimum level of competency and ability to do this with a certain number of applied hours. There's a lot of people out there who are motivational speakers. So, which is great and a huge asset, and also not the same thing. So if we want to be actively developing skills, just like we develop sports skills and physical conditioning skills, you want someone who can methodically and strategically train those skills. So if you're looking for somebody to be in that position, CMPC would be fantastic. Look for somebody who's going to actually tell you how they help you get better. So it's not just something like, oh, we're going to build their confidence. I would ask, how are you going to do that? What does that look like in my environment? Because there's a lot of people who can also just come in and start talking about why confidence is important and how we might find barriers to confidence. And that's wonderful, because the more information you have, the more empowered you are to make decisions. But if you can't have a coach who can come in and say, this is how you actually make it better. So for example, here we've talked a little bit about how girls like to compete just as much as anybody else, but we've also talked a little bit about, well, they also are really collaboratively driven, right? Their relationships are super important. So you would want somebody who can come in and say, okay, with this in mind, this is how we are going to foster an environment of competition in a way that's most productive for females, right? And maybe in the strength and conditioning space, like Vic is talking about here, that we want to track progress and we want people to compete, but maybe you want to actually create a collaborative competition so that they're working together to achieve something where they can still measure their own progress. Or if you're going to be out on the soccer field, going 1v1 is one way to demonstrate skill, but you're going to see a lot of competitive juices flowing in the female space when you're able to work together in a new capacity. So with that in mind, like finding a resource that actually is going to describe to you how you can implement confidence building, how you can harness focus under pressure, not just the fact that it's important. So the Association for Applied Sports Psychology would be a great resource. That's appliedsportspsych.org if you're interested in looking out resources there, where you can find a lot of qualified professionals to help support in that space.
Fantastic. Okay. That is going to wrap it up for us here today. Thank you so much for the panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. If anybody has additional questions, to reach out to us after the fact. Obviously, if it's posted on YouTube or whatever, you can comment, but you can also reach out to support@voltathletics.com, and we'd be happy to take your questions.